You've got about 30 seconds to get off this street before I make your whole summer disappear." Grant Dover doesn't ask, he announces. And the way he says it, flat casual the way a man orders coffee he's ordered 1,000 times before, makes it clear that he has said something like this before many times, and that nothing has ever come from it, except the sound of someone moving faster than they wanted to. Elijah Cross is still on his back, half under the front axle of his truck, when the shadow falls across him. He can hear the cruiser's engine ticking as it cools. Dover killed it fast, the way men do when they want to seem like they're already in charge of the situation before they've said a word. Elijah doesn't flinch. He doesn't scramble. He doesn't do the thing that the shadow expects him to do, which is to come out from under the truck quickly, apologetically, hands already rising to show they're empty. Instead, he sets the wrench down, deliberately. The sound of metal on asphalt is soft and unhurried, and it takes exactly as long as it should take, which is longer than Dover would like. Then he slides out from under the chassis the same way he went in, slowly, methodically, turning onto his side, pushing up with one hand, rising to his feet in the way of a man who has all the time in the world, and knows it even if the man standing over him does not. Dover is already out of his cruiser. He didn't bother closing the door behind him, the kind of detail that tells you everything about how seriously a man takes the situation in front of him, which is to say he doesn't take it seriously at all, not yet because he has already decided how this ends, and closing the door is something you do when you plan to be somewhere for a while. Elijah stands. He is not tall. He is not imposing. He wears a gray work shirt with a small grease stain at the left pocket, dark work pants and boots with cracked soles that have put in a great many miles on a great many different kinds of ground. He looks like exactly what he is, or rather what Dover has already decided he is before either of them has spoken a full sentence, a man who doesn't belong here doing something that doesn't make sense here on a street where Grant Dover has decided the rules belong to Grant Dover. What Dover cannot see, and what Elijah Cross knows with a quiet and specific certainty, is the small black device mounted to the inside of the windshield just behind the rearview mirror of the truck. It is a dashcam. It runs on its own independent battery circuit separate from the vehicle's electrical system. It has been recording since the moment Elijah pulled onto Aberorn Street. The red indicator light blinks once and then twice, steady as a heartbeat. Grant Dover picked the wrong man on the wrong street in front of the wrong camera. If you believe what happens next should cost this officer everything, keep watching. Because it will. The morning had started the way Elijah Cross's mornings always started, which was with a list. Not a mental list. Not the kind that lives in your head and rearranges itself while you're in the shower and loses items between the kitchen and the front door. A written list. Narrow-ruled paper ballpoint pen, the same blue Bic he'd been buying in packs of 12 for 30 years. Each item carrying a small checkbox to its left and a time estimate to its right, written out in the particular handwriting of a man who has learned to make his letters clear enough that there is never any question later about what they say. He had been keeping lists like this since he was 22 years old, and the reason had nothing to do with productivity or efficiency or any of the things that people who sell planners like to talk about. The reason was documentation. There was a difference between a list that helped you get things done and a list that proved you had done them, and Elijah Cross had learned that difference at an age when most people were still figuring out what they wanted from their 20s, and the learning had never left him. The truck had been giving him trouble for 3 weeks. A failing fuel pump. Nothing catastrophic, nothing dramatic. Just the slow and accumulative protest of a vehicle that had 143,000 miles on it and was beginning to register in its own mechanical way the weight of all those miles and all those years. He had ordered the part 9 days ago from an auto supply warehouse 2 counties over, and it had arrived on a Wednesday morning in a box that was slightly too large for what it contained, the way parts always arrive packed in more styrofoam than seemed necessary. He had planned the repair for Saturday morning deliberately and for specific reasons. Saturday mornings meant light traffic on Aberorn Street. Light traffic meant room to work without a procession of passing vehicles making the shoulder feel like the edge of a cliff. It meant he could take his time, which was important because Elijah Cross did not like to rush repairs any more than he liked to rush anything else that mattered. He had loaded the truck bed the night before, laying everything out in the order he would need it. Jack Stan's torque wrench rubber mallet, a collapsible work light on a telescoping arm that he'd had for 11 years and which had outlasted 2 vehicles and 1 apartment. The orange reflective triangles were already unfolded and ready to deploy, pre-positioned with their hinges open so that in an emergency he could have them standing at proper intervals in under 45 seconds. At 6:51 in the morning on a Saturday in July, Elijah Cross pulled his truck onto the shoulder of Aberorn Street at the intersection of 52nd, and before he did anything else, before he touched a tool, before he looked under the hood, before he unfolded a single triangle, he got out, and he read the parking sign. He always read the sign before he got out. This was a habit, and like all habits, it had been built through repetition, that began with a reason, and the reason was that signs said things that mattered and that people who didn't read them could be made to pay for their ignorance in ways that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with whoever was standing nearby with the authority to interpret the situation in their favor. The sign read, "No parking 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. weekdays. Exception disabled vehicle or emergency breakdown. Maximum 2 hours." He read it twice. Then he took out his small spiral notebook, the one with the blue cover slightly worn at the corner, and he wrote 6:51 a.m. Arrived Aberorn at 52nd. Sign read, "Exception clause applies. Triangles deploying." And then he went to work. It was quiet on Aberorn that early. The way streets are quiet in July before the heat has fully declared itself and the day has committed to being what it's going to be. A delivery truck rolled through without slowing. 2 joggers passed on the opposite sidewalk, one of them glancing at the truck with the brief curiosity of people who notice something out of place but don't stop to investigate it. A woman in her mid-60s came around the corner with a small tan dog on a short leash, and the dog made a determined investigation of the truck's rear tire before the woman tugged it gently away, and she looked at Elijah with a nod of acknowledgement. The particular nod of a person who has walked the same street for years and knows what belongs on it and what doesn't, and has decided that Elijah Cross belongs on it, and he nodded back, and she continued on her way. Her name was Nora Bell, though Elijah didn't know that yet. He would know it later, and it would matter. He worked methodically the way he did everything, every tool returning to its designated spot the moment he was done with it. Every removed part laid out on a clean shop rag in the order of removal left to right, so that when it was time to put things back, there would be no searching, no confusion, no reaching for something that wasn't where it should be. There was a logic to it that had become, after enough years, something closer to a physical reflex than a conscious decision. The same way the notebook had become a reflex, the same way reading the sign had become a reflex, all of it. Part of a system that Elijah Cross had built for himself, piece by piece, out of the understanding that the world was not arranged to make things easy for him, and that the only answer to that understanding was to be more prepared than the world expected him to be. The first time Grant Dover's cruiser rolled past it was 7:58 in the morning. Elijah was on his back under the truck, his head angled toward the fuel pump housing when he heard the engine slow. He heard the particular change in road noise that a vehicle makes when it drops speed without breaking, the kind of deliberate deceleration that is different from a car slowing for a light or a stop sign. Different in a way that is subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice it, but that Elijah Cross had developed the habit of noticing. He heard the crunch of tires pulling slightly onto the shoulder gravel, not fully just enough, and then he heard the engine idle. He counted the seconds in his head, an old habit the way some people count to calm themselves and others count because counting is data. 9 seconds. Then the engine sound shifted back into traffic, and the cruiser pulled away. Elijah did not come out from under the truck. He noted the time. 7:58 a.m. cruiser passed, idled, 9 seconds departed, and he kept working. The second pass came at 8:31 a.m., and this time it stopped. "You got a reason to be parked here?" Elijah slid out from under the chassis, taking the same unhurried amount of time it always took, and when he stood up and found himself looking at the officer standing at the shoulder of the road with his thumbs hooked into his belt and his expression arranged into something that was meant to look like professional neutrality, but was actually closer to the specific kind of impatience that comes from a man who expects a certain response and is already mildly annoyed that it's taking this long to arrive. Elijah looked at the badge first, then the nameplate below it. He read both before he said a single word. Badge number 3317, name Dover, fuel pump repair. Elijah said his voice even and unhurried, the same tone he might use to tell someone the time. Truck broke down. I've been here since 6:51. You got paperwork for this vehicle registration and insurance in the glove box. He retrieved the documents without rushing, handing them over without comment, and he watched Dover examine them in the particular way that a man examines something when he is hoping to find something wrong with it. The deliberate slowness, the small tightening around the eyes, the way the fingers move across the edge of the page as if the wrongness might be somewhere along the border, if he just applies enough attention. Dover didn't find anything wrong because there was nothing wrong to find, and after a long moment he handed the documents back with the expression of a man who has been briefly disappointed. He looked at the sign. He looked at Elijah. You're aware this is a no parking zone. There's an exception clause for vehicle breakdowns, Elijah said without looking at the sign because he had already memorized it. Maximum 2 hours. I've been here less than 100 minutes. Dover said nothing for a moment. He wrote something in his own notebook, a small official-looking thing with a departmental seal embossed on the cover, and then he walked back to his cruiser and sat in it for 5 minutes before pulling away. Elijah watched him go in his peripheral vision. Then he wrote down the time, the badge number, and what had been said in the order it had been said. The third pass came at 9:22 in the morning, and this time there were 2 of them. Dover's cruiser pulled in from the front. A second cruiser came in from behind, pulling up close to the truck's rear bumper, blocking it from both directions, in a way that was not standard procedure for a routine parking check, and that anyone familiar with standard procedure would recognize immediately as something other than routine. The second officer was a woman, early 30s, short hair, nameplate reading Hatch with the particular manner of someone who has practiced being approachable the way other people practice being professional. A warmth that was real enough on the surface, but that sat on top of something more calculated underneath. Morning, she said, smiling. Having some trouble. Fuel pump, Elijah said. Oh, that's a pain. How long do you think you'll be? Another hour, maybe less. She nodded sympathetically and began asking the kind of careful, friendly questions that are designed to feel like conversation. The make and model of the truck. How far he'd driven it that morning. Whether he needed a recommendation for a tow service that wouldn't overcharge. And while she was asking them, while her voice was doing the work of putting him at ease, she positioned herself alongside the rear of the truck and raised her phone. She photographed the license plate once, then a second time from a slightly different angle, and she did not mention that she was doing it. Elijah did not look at her phone. He looked at the way she was standing, angled slightly away. Screen tilted the particular tuck of the elbow that people use when they want a recorded gesture to look incidental rather than deliberate. And he noted the time. 9:23 a.m. Officer Hatch photographed plate. No stated reason. And then as Hatch walked back toward her cruiser, Elijah heard Dover's voice, low, directed sideways. Not meant for Elijah, just 2 words delivered with the casual grammar of a man who expects to find what he's looking for if he just looks long enough. Run him again. Elijah noted that too. The fourth pass came at 10:49 in the morning, and this time there was no slowing down, no preliminary reconnaissance, no pretense of routine procedure. Dover's cruiser pulled up onto the shoulder hard gravel scattering out from under the tires in a small spray that caught the morning light, and Dover was out of the vehicle before the engine had fully settled, moving with the particular forward momentum of a man who has made a decision somewhere between the last stop and this one, and is no longer interested in the version of events where anything goes differently than he's planned. He didn't look at the sign. He didn't look at the tools laid out on the shop rag, or the reflective triangles standing at their proper intervals on the shoulder. He looked at Elijah. "Step away from the truck and stand on the sidewalk." Elijah set down the wrench he was holding carefully in the same deliberate way he'd set down the first one 2 hours ago, returning it to its spot on the rag with the same unhurried precision he would have used if Dover weren't standing 15 feet away, with his jaw already tight and his right hand resting near his belt. He stood. "Is there a problem? Step away from the truck. I'd like to understand the reason for the request first." He stepped to the sidewalk anyway because compliance was the point, not argument, and Elijah Cross had understood for a very long time that the way you won certain conversations was not by refusing to move, but by moving while making it absolutely clear at every moment that you were choosing to move, and that your choice was on the record, and his hands came to rest at his sides, open and visible, in the posture of a man who has nothing to hide and knows it, and wants that knowledge to exist somewhere other than just in his own head. The dash cam behind the truck's windshield was still running. The red light was still blinking. Elijah knew it, and that knowledge was the only thing in his expression, not fear, not contempt, not the particular sharp edge of a man who is angry and trying not to show it, but awareness. The specific and grounded awareness of someone who understands exactly what is being created in this moment and for whom. "You're in violation of Savannah Municipal Code," Dover said. "Obstruction of a public way. Unauthorized use of a no parking zone." He moved toward the truck, gesturing at the sign on its post with the confidence of a man citing evidence he hasn't actually read. "Sir?" Elijah's voice was quiet and even. "What does the sign say at the third line?" Dover stopped. "The exception clause," Elijah continued. "What does it say? I'm not going to read you the sign." "Then I will." He looked at it not because he needed to look, not because he had forgotten what it said, but as a demonstration, the kind of deliberate and unhurried action that makes a point more clearly than any argument could make it. And his voice was the same voice he'd used all morning, steady and declarative without heat. Exception. Disabled vehicle or emergency breakdown. Maximum 2 hours. The sign applies from 7 a.m. I arrived at 6:51. It is currently 10:49 a.m. I have been on scene for 118 minutes from the time the restriction began. I am within the grace period. The words sat in the morning heat between them, and Dover looked at the sign for one long moment, and something happened behind his eyes. Something that was not doubt exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man whose authority is being named out loud, in a language he wasn't expecting to encounter, and who does not have an answer to it and knows he doesn't and is beginning to understand that the absence of an answer is a problem. And then Grant Dover said the thing that would follow him for the rest of his professional life, said it with the flat certainty of a man who has spent so long being the final word on things that he has forgotten. There are other words besides his. I decide what the sign means. 3 seconds of silence. And in those 3 seconds, at the edge of the sidewalk behind Elijah, something moved. Nora Bell had looped back on her morning walk. The dog had wanted to go the long way around, the way it sometimes did, pulling gently toward the shaded side of the block, and she had let it because she had time, and it was Saturday, and the morning was still cool enough to be pleasant. She had come back around the corner of Aberorn and 52nd, and she had seen the 2 cruisers and the man she had nodded to an hour and a half ago, the man who had been working on his truck in the methodical and unhurried way of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and she had stopped. She stood at the edge of the sidewalk with the dog's leash held short in her right hand, and she did not speak, and she did not move, because something in the tableau in front of her, the 2 cruisers, the officer's posture, the way the man in the gray work shirt was standing with his hands at his sides and his back straight, told her in the wordless way that a lifetime of experience sometimes tells you things, that this was a moment that mattered, and that the right thing to do in a moment that mattered was to stay and bear witness to it. Dover moved forward. His voice had changed, the measured contempt of the first 3 passes replaced by something tighter, something that had a current of genuine anger running underneath the official language, the anger of a man who is losing the version of events he arrived with. "Turn around. You're under arrest. Trespassing under Georgia law. Obstruction. Am I being detained or arrested?" "You're being arrested. Turn around. I'd like to hear the specific probable cause." Dover reached out and took Elijah's left arm at the elbow, pulling it behind his back with a torque that was sharper and harder than any lawful arrest procedure required, the kind of grip that leaves a mark, the kind that is meant to communicate something beyond restraint, the kind that says, "I can touch you, and you can't stop me." And that is what matters here. Elijah did not resist. He did not yell, did not twist, did not pull away. He absorbed the grip completely, and when his right arm was pulled to join the left and the cuffs clicked into place, he turned his face toward the truck's windshield, and he spoke clearly, calmly, and with precise intention. "I am not resisting. I am complying." The time is 10:49 a.m. He was not speaking to Dover. He was speaking to the camera. He was speaking to this moment and to every moment that would come after it, and to every person who would eventually see what that camera had kept. Dover's hand hit him between the shoulder blades, palm flat, driving him forward toward the cruiser. Unnecessary, unprovoked, delivered to a man who had already stopped moving, and who had given no reason at any point in the preceding 2 hours for anything other than a conversation about a parking sign. Nora Bell watched all of it. She watched the cuffs go on, and the hand on the back, and the cruiser door, and the way Elijah Cross went through all of it without making a sound that wasn't deliberate and controlled and chosen. And when the cruiser pulled away from the shoulder, she stood there for a moment on the sidewalk with the dog sitting at her feet, and then she took her phone out of her pocket, and she photographed the truck. The triangles standing at their intervals, the tools laid out in order on the shop rag, and the sign on its post, with the exception clause at the third line clearly visible in the morning light. She didn't know exactly why she did it. She only knew that it felt important, and that feeling important was enough. The camera behind the windshield was still recording. The red light blinked on. The booking room at the precinct had the particular quality of institutional fluorescence, the kind of overhead light that makes everything look slightly past its expiration date, that turns skin tones into something close to the color of old paper, and makes the shadows under people's eyes look deeper than they are, that gives the whole space the feeling of a room that has processed too many difficult things for too many years, and has stopped trying to look like it hasn't. Elijah Cross sat in a plastic chair and kept his hands visible on his knees, and answered only the questions that booking required in the flattest and most precise language available to him, because precision was the best tool he had in this room, and he was not going to waste it on anything that wasn't required. When the officer across the intake table asked whether he understood the charges against him, Elijah said, "Yes." When the officer asked if he had anything to add, Elijah said, "I'd like to speak with an attorney before answering any further questions." And then he stopped speaking, and he did not fill the silence that followed, and the silence was considerable, because a man sitting in a booking room who does not fill the silence with explanations or protests or reassurances is a man who makes people in booking rooms uncomfortable in ways they don't fully understand. He noted the clock over the door. He noted the badge numbers of every officer who spoke to him. He noted the exact words they used in the exact order they used them, and he stored all of it in the part of his mind that had been keeping records like this for 11 years. In the corner of the room, at a processing terminal near the far wall, a young man was working through intake paperwork with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned to keep his head down and his screen to himself. His name tag read Reyes. He was in his late 20s with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been at this job long enough to stop being surprised by it, but not long enough to stop being troubled by it. At one point, his eyes met Elijah's briefly a moment of accidental contact across the fluorescent-lit room, and then he looked away, back to his screen with the particular care of someone who has decided that whatever he just saw, he is not going to be the one to decide what it means. From the hallway low and sideways came Dover's voice, not directed at Elijah, not meant to be heard by Elijah, just one side of a short exchange with someone else. He say anything at the scene. A pause. Nothing useful. Elijah filed it away, the same way he had filed away everything else that morning. Sergeant Wayne Pruitt arrived at the desk 25 minutes after Elijah was walked into the room. He was a compact man in his late 50s with a silver blonde crew cut and the particular bearing of someone whose authority has become so ingrained that it no longer requires any visible effort to maintain a man who walks into rooms and simply is in charge of them, not because he announces it, but because he has been in charge of rooms for long enough that the posture has become the man. He wore his badge the way certain people wear certainty without thinking about it because it no longer occurred to them that it could be otherwise. He stood at the sergeant's desk and read the file Dover had started. He read it for 3 minutes without expression, and then he looked through the doorway at Elijah, not at the intake officer, not at the paperwork at Elijah himself with the appraising quality of a man taking a measurement, and then he went back to the terminal without saying a word to anyone. Adam Reyes at his own terminal nearby heard the specific sounds that followed the rhythm of keys. A long pause, more keys, another pause, and then more keys, which was the rhythm, not of someone writing but of someone revising. And the difference between those two rhythms was something Adam Reyes understood, because he had been at this long enough to know what writing sounded like and what rewriting sounded like. He looked at the clock. He looked at the corner of Pruitt's screen, the part he could see from his angle, which was not much, just the edge of a document and the scrolling of text. And then he looked back at his own work. Something was wrong. Adam Reyes was 27 years old and had a car payment and had been at this job for 14 months, and he knew that something was wrong, and he went back to his own screen and said nothing, and that silence would sit inside him for 11 days before he knew what to do with it. The file creation timestamp would later show 11:04 a.m. 11 minutes after Elijah was booked. The narrative field was blank. Pruitt was still at the terminal at 2:47 in the afternoon, with Elijah still in the building in a chair 12 feet from the bullpen, not knowing that the document describing what had happened to him was being shaped word by word and minute by minute into a different version of events entirely. Cecile Harmon arrived at the precinct at 2:19 in the afternoon, and she was not loud. Attorneys who are loud in booking rooms are attorneys who don't intend to stay long, who come in with noise because noise is all they have, because the facts aren't on their side, or the documentation isn't sufficient, or they need the performance to substitute for the substance. Cecile Harmon was not that kind of attorney. She came in quietly with a leather document case and eyes that read a room the way an engineer reads a blueprint, systematically noting what was where, what connected to what looked like it was supposed to be there, and what didn't. She spent 11 minutes alone with Elijah. When she came out, she asked the desk officer for a copy of the incident report. She was given one. She read the date and time fields. She read the narrative. She read it again. Then she looked at the timestamp on her own phone and wrote something in her yellow legal pad that she underlined once. My client is prepared to cooperate fully with any lawful process, she told the desk officer in the even and entirely pleasant voice of someone who has decided exactly where the lines are and intends to stand at them without flinching. He is not prepared to sign or acknowledge any document without my review. That applies to all documents, regardless of how they're characterized. The desk officer said he understood. Cecile did not look like she believed him. In the parking lot at 6:22 in the evening, in the thick July heat that had accumulated all day and showed no signs of releasing any of it, Cecile walked Elijah through the charges, trespassing, obstruction, and through what came next, which was a FOIA request filed in the morning and a preservation order on the truck that needed to happen before anything else. She flagged the timestamps before they'd been in the parking lot 3 minutes because the timestamps were the thing that had stopped her cold when she was reading the report inside. File created 11 minutes after the arrest. Narrative field blank. Revised version saved 3 hours and 43 minutes later with a full narrative written in and a contact time that had gone from blank to 10:30 a.m., which was 19 minutes earlier than what Elijah had told her and what the parking signs exception clause would require. 19 minutes, she said. If initial contact was at 10:30, the grace period calculation changes. Not definitively, but it changes. If the report says 10:30 and something else shows a different time. The dash cam, Elijah said. Cecile's pen stopped moving. It runs on its own battery circuit. Elijah continued in the same unhurried way he said most things. Independent of the vehicle's electrical system, it was recording when they towed the truck. It has been recording since 6:51 this morning. 3 seconds of silence, the particular kind that happens when a piece of information lands and shifts the entire weight of everything around it. You mean? Everything. Every approach. Every conversation. Everything Dover said. The timestamp of the arrest. All of it. Cecile looked at him. She had the expression of someone who has been doing this work for a long time, and who has learned to keep recalibrating because the facts always turn out to be arranged differently than you first thought, but who has rarely had to recalibrate quite this quickly or quite this significantly. "What do you do for work, Marcus?" She stopped. "Elijah. What do you do?" "Get the preservation order," he said. "I'll tell you when you need to know." 8 days after the arrest, a letter arrived at Elijah Cross's employer on official Savannah Police Department letterhead bearing the signature of Sergeant Wayne Pruitt and citing a statutory reference to pending criminal charges and an open investigation, and noting in language that was technically careful and specifically chosen that the nature of the allegations might affect the subject's clearance status and professional standing. The word clearance was not an accident. Pruitt had run Elijah's name and gotten a result that confused him a level of institutional affiliation that didn't match the image of a man in a gray work shirt lying under a truck on Aberorn Street, and he had written that word into the letter, the way a man uses a tool he doesn't fully understand but has decided to swing anyway because swinging is what he knows how to do. Elijah's supervisor called him in that afternoon. He was a decent man in an impossible position holding the letter at the corner, the way people hold things they don't want to be seen holding. And he said the things that decent men in impossible positions say, that he was sure it was a misunderstanding, that he was required to notify HR that he was sorry, but that Elijah would need to take administrative leave effective immediately unpaid until the matter was resolved. "I understand," Elijah said. He drove home. He opened his notebook to a clean page. He made a list. That same afternoon in the precinct records room, Adam Reyes was processing archived files when he came across something he hadn't been looking for. The audit trail of Pruitt's edits to the original incident report, generated automatically by the department's filing system and stored in a folder that most people didn't know existed, because most people had never needed to know it existed. The trail showed timestamps, field changes, the before and after of every alteration. The original blank narrative, the revised contact time, the specific minutes in which the document had been transformed from one thing into another. Adam sat with it for a while, reading it in the way you read something that you wish you hadn't seen, and then he closed the folder and went back to his other files, and the knowledge of what he had read sat inside him like a stone that he couldn't put down and couldn't carry comfortably. He looked at his badge in his desk drawer before he left for the day. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed the drawer and went home. The FOIA documents arrived 9 days after Cecile filed the request, which was 6 days past the statutory deadline, by which point Cecile had already sent 2 written notices of violation to the records office and copied the Georgia Attorney General's office on both because documentation was how this was going to work and every piece of it mattered. She spread the contents across the conference table in her office on a Wednesday afternoon, with Elijah sitting across from her, and they went through them page by page, the way you go through evidence methodically without skipping ahead, giving each document the attention it required before moving to the next one, because the story was in the sequence, and the sequence required patience. The metadata comparison came first. Cecile had requested the full version history of the incident report, and what she had in front of her now were the 2 versions side by side, annotated with timestamps, and the specific field changes between them. a document that told the story of what had happened to the truth of that Saturday morning in the precinct as clearly as the dash cam told the story of what had happened on Aberorn Street. Version 1 file created at 11:04 a.m., 11 minutes after Elijah was booked. Narrative field completely blank. Contact time field blank. Version 2 file last modified at 2:47 p.m. the same afternoon. Narrative field fully written. Contact time 10:30 a.m. 3 hours and 43 minutes between those two timestamps, and in that time the blank had become a story, and the story had been written by a man who wasn't there, and who had changed a number that would have mattered if the camera hadn't been running. If the report says 10:30, Cecile said, and the dash cam says 10:49, we have a falsified official document. That's not a paperwork error. That's a felony under Georgia law. She set a second document on the table. And there's something else. The email thread had been retrieved through the FOIA request. Internal communications Prewitt to Hatch sent at 1:58 in the afternoon of the same day. Subject line Aberorn stop follow-up. Cecile read it aloud in the flat and careful voice of someone who has learned that certain things don't need any help being what they are. Make sure the log reflects contact was initiated at 10:30, not 10:49. The minutes matter for the grace period. The room was very quiet. Hatch's reply had come 14 minutes later. Done. Also, subject didn't ask for counsel until after booking questions started. Might be useful. That's not accurate, Elijah said, and his voice was the same even voice he'd used all morning on Aberorn Street. I requested counsel before any questioning began. I said it clearly. It's on the dash cam audio. I know, Cecile said. She continued to the third document, an email from a city council office address sent to Prewitt the morning after the arrest, copied to a name identified only by 2 initials. Saw the report. Handle it quietly. We don't need this on the agenda. Elijah read that line twice. A city council member, he said quietly, was informed from day 2. Was informed, Cecile said carefully, which may be all the prosecution needs. The call from the landlord came on a Wednesday evening, and it had the particular quality of a call from a man who has made a decision he knows is wrong, and is hoping that the apologetic softness of his voice will do something to compensate for the wrongness of the decision itself. I've had some calls, the landlord said. From the city. About the situation. They were asking about the lease, whether there'd been any noise complaints, any issues with the neighbors. What was the name of the person calling, Elijah asked. A pause. She didn't give one. Said she was from the city administrator's office. Elijah thanked him for telling him. Said that he understood. Said that he wasn't going to put him in a position that cost him anything, and that he would make arrangements. He called Cecile that night. She added it to the file Apparent Pressure Campaign's city administrative involvement, and noted that using official channels to contact a private citizen's landlord for the purpose of creating housing instability during pending litigation was potentially actionable in ways that would add to the overall weight of the case being built. Elijah moved into a furnished room near the water paying week to week, and he kept his tools in the truck bed and his documents in a waterproof accordion folder on the passenger seat, and he did not stop taking notes. The second pressure came through official channels. A pre-hearing conference request, formal and procedurally proper on its surface, with Prewitt, a union representative named Carl Briggs, and a document waiting on the conference table when Cecile and Elijah arrived at the city attorney's office. The document was labeled a clarification statement. It reframed Elijah's reading of the parking sign as a verbal altercation initiated by the subject, and it described his statement to the dash cam. I am not resisting. I am complying. The time is 10:49 as threatening language and refusal to comply with lawful orders. Every true thing in it had been inverted. It was extraordinary work in a certain grim way. Cecile set it down after reading it in full. My client won't be signing this. Briggs leaned forward across the table, and his voice had the practiced warmth of a man who has spent a long time delivering bad news in ways that are meant to feel like concern. A misdemeanor plea closes this without a record. A public session exposes your client to attention that may not serve his interests. People have backgrounds, situations they'd prefer to keep private. The implication was clear. We looked into you and we found something, and you should be worried about what we found. Elijah looked at him with an expression that had nothing in it except attentiveness. I'd like that in writing, he said. Whatever you think you found, put it in writing and send it to Ms. Harmon. Briggs did not put anything in writing. The meeting ended 11 minutes later, and in the elevator afterward, Cecile looked at Elijah with the particular expression of someone who has just watched a chess player refuse a draw that the other side has desperately offered. They're scared, she said. They're guessing, he said. They ran my name and got a result that confused them. Now they know it means something, but they don't know what yet. Paula Gentry had been tracking the Aberorn Street corridor for 6 weeks before she had a named source. She was an independent journalist, the kind who covered local accountability stories for a small outlet that paid modestly and expected precision, and she had been quietly collecting what the public record would give her 4 vehicle stops by Dover in a single month, all on the same stretch of Aberorn, all involving black male drivers, all with vehicles impounded, none with charges that held in any meaningful way. And she had the pattern, but she didn't have a witness. And without a witness, the pattern was an argument, and arguments needed to be proven. Nora Bell called her on a Tuesday morning. She had seen Paula's earlier piece, a brief thing carefully hedged referencing the stops without naming names or offering testimony. And she had read it twice, and then she had gone to her kitchen table and sat with her photographs from July 14th spread out in front of her, and thought about what it meant to have seen something and taken a picture of it and said nothing yet. And she had decided that saying nothing yet had a reasonable limit, and that limit had passed. She gave Paula the photographs, the truck, the triangles at their proper intervals, the tools on the rag, the sign with the exception clause clearly visible at the 3rd line in the morning light, and then she gave her something more. She had walked Aberorn Street every morning for 6 years. She had seen Dover's cruiser at that same stretch of shoulder before. She described 2 other mornings, 2 other men pulled over near the same sign in the same way, and she described them with the specificity of a person who pays attention to what happens on the street she has walked 6 days a week for 6 years, and who has stored those observations in the way you store things that trouble you, but that you haven't yet found the right use for. Paula wrote it all down and did not publish it yet, because she needed the official record to catch up to what she had in her notepad. 3 days later, Adam Reyes came home from a shift and opened his laptop and found Paula's earlier piece in a link someone had posted to a neighborhood group, and he read it once. And then he sat at his kitchen table with the folded printout he had been carrying in his jacket for 11 days, and he looked at it for a long time without opening it. He was not a brave man in any obvious sense. He was a 27-year-old with a car payment and 14 months in a job he needed, and the thing in his jacket was a document that implicated his sergeant, and he understood what that meant in practical terms for someone in his position. But he had read what Nora Bell had seen on Aberorn Street, and he had been in that booking room, and he had heard the sound of Prewitt's keys, and the weight of the folded paper in his jacket had become over 11 days heavier than the weight of what it would cost him to put it down. He took the printout out of his jacket. He unfolded it on the kitchen table. He picked up his phone and dialed the IA tip line anonymous, and when the recording prompt ended, he read from the printout. The file numbers, the timestamps, the before and after of every field change in a slow and steady voice. And when he was done, he hung up and sat in the quiet of his apartment for a while before he went to bed. That call routed to Dean Tolliver, Internal Affairs, 14 years in. Tolliver pulled the audit trail from the department's off-site compliance server that same night, read only unalterable exactly as Adam had described. He called Cecile Harmon the following morning. Cecile had filed the preservation order the night of Elijah's release, the same night within 2 hours of dropping him at his truck's impound location on Louisville Road, because a dash cam on an independent battery circuit was only useful for as long as nobody touched it. And the gap between nobody has touched it yet and somebody has touched it was the kind of gap that closes without warning and without announcement. The vehicle was held. An IT specialist contracted through Cecile's firm drove to the impound facility 12 days after the arrest with a formal authorization and a chain of custody form that left no ambiguity about who had touched what, in what order, and at what time, which was the only way to carry evidence that would survive a courtroom. The footage was downloaded on site. The original memory card was retained and sealed. The copy was transferred to an encrypted drive and signed for at every step of the process. The camera had run on its own circuit throughout. The truck being towed had not interrupted it. The truck sitting in impound for 12 days had not interrupted it. Everything that had happened on Aberorn Street from 6:51 in the morning onward was exactly where Elijah had said it would be. Cecile and Elijah watched it together at her office the following afternoon on a laptop set on the conference table, the blinds angled against the afternoon glare. The timestamp in the corner of the frame was the first thing Cecile marked when the footage began a habit, the professional instinct of someone who has learned to anchor every piece of evidence to time before she does anything else with it. Because time is the thing that either holds a case together or pulls it apart, and there is no substitute for knowing which one you're dealing with. Dover's first pass, 7:58 a.m., the timestamp crisp and unambiguous in the upper right corner, the cruiser's front end visible through the windshield as it slowed along the shoulder 9 seconds of idle, exactly as Elijah had written in his notebook, and then pulling back into traffic and disappearing. Dover's second pass, 8:31 a.m. Elijah sliding out from under the truck, the camera capturing the whole exchange from behind the glass. Dover's expression, visible in the way that a wide-angle lens captures things that people don't know are being captured. The deliberate slowness of the document examination, the writing in the notebook the 5 minutes in the cruiser before departure. Dover's third pass, 9:22 a.m. 2 cruisers on the timestamp. Hatch visible through the windshield as she positioned herself near the rear of the truck. The angle of her phone in her hand unmistakable, the specific tuck of her elbow that Elijah had noted and written down, and that was now visible to anyone watching this footage in exactly the way he had described it. And then Dover's voice, faint but recoverable in the audio, run him again. And the fourth pass, the last one, and here Cecile paused the footage and looked at the timestamp. 10:49 a.m., not 10:30. Not the number that appeared in Prewitt's revised version of the incident report. Not the number that Prewitt had emailed Hatch about the number that mattered for the grace period. The number in the corner of the frame generated by the camera's own independent clock, which had no reason to lie and no person to answer to, was 10:49. She wrote it in her legal pad and drew a box around it, and then she let the footage run. The arrest played out in the wide-angle view of the windshield camera. Dover's approach, his momentum, the way his body language had changed from the earlier passes into something less measured and more committed. The way a man moves when he has decided that this is how it ends, regardless of how it should end. Elijah stepping to the sidewalk, hands loose at his sides. His posture, the posture of a man who is not going to make this anything other than what it needs to be. The reach for his arm. The grip. And Cecile watched the angle of it, the specific geometry of Dover's hand on Elijah's elbow, and she wrote, "Force unnecessary," and underlined it, and then the cuffs, and then Elijah's face turning toward the windshield, and then his voice clear in the audio. "I am not resisting. I am complying. The time is 10:49 a.m. And then the shove palm between the shoulder blades, full weight behind it, delivered to a man who was already moving in the direction he'd been told to move, who had given no resistance at any point, and who was walking compliantly toward the cruiser, when Dover's hand hit his back with the specific force of a man who needed to put something somewhere, and chose Elijah Cross to put it in. Cecile sat back. She looked at the frozen frame. She looked at Elijah, who was watching the screen without expression in the particular stillness of someone who is seeing something they already knew and experiencing the strange doubling of having known it and now watching it confirmed. He knew, she said quietly. When he said the time to the camera, he knew this footage was going to be exactly what it is. The report says 10:30, Elijah said. The camera says 10:49. The email says the minutes matter. And the email was sent before the footage was recovered, before anyone knew we had it, which means they coordinated the lie before they knew the lie was on record. Cecile looked at her notes. She looked at the email. She looked at the frame counter on the footage. It's not just the grace period, she said, slowly building the architecture of it as she spoke. The timestamps prove the document was falsified. The email proves intent. And the original blank narrative field proves the report wasn't written at the scene the way it's supposed to be. It was written 3 hours later in the building while you were still sitting 12 feet away. She turned to a fresh page. There's also the ATM across the street. The corner of Aberorn and 52nd, Cecile said. First Heritage Bank branch on the northeast corner. The ATM faces the street. Yes, Elijah said. She looked at him carefully. You knew about the ATM before you pulled onto the shoulder. It wasn't quite a question, and Elijah didn't treat it as one. I try to know the geography of where I'm working, he said. The subpoena went to First Heritage Bank the following week. The bank's legal department responded in 5 days, which was considerably faster than the police department had responded to anything. And the footage arrived with a formal authentication letter and a chain of custody document that matched the standards Cecile had requested. What the ATM camera had captured was different from the dashcam footage, a wider angle, lower quality, no audio. But what it showed was sufficient and specific and entirely clear to anyone who watched it for 30 seconds. It showed Dover approaching Elijah in the precinct parking lot 4 days after the arrest, at a time when Elijah had been waiting for release paperwork, and Dover had no professional reason to be within 20 feet of him. It showed Dover closing the distance, the forward lean, the shoulder contact, the deliberate push that was not a brush, not an accidental proximity, not anything other than what it was. And it showed Elijah's single lateral step in response, clean, controlled, no escalation, no reaction beyond the step itself, and then the two of them separating and Elijah walking to his vehicle and leaving. A pedestrian had crossed the lot entrance during the exchange. Dover had glanced toward them. Then he had stepped back. Then Elijah had walked away. Cecile submitted the ATM footage for authentication that afternoon, and when it came back, confirmed, she set it on the table between them and looked at Elijah for a long moment. Now she said, "Tell me." Elijah told her the way he did most things quietly, in the order the information needed to go without performance and without drama, the way you give someone facts that are going to change the shape of what they're working on. For 11 years, he had been a senior investigator with the State Office of Law Enforcement Accountability. He reviewed officer conduct across 3 states. He had authored reports that resulted in disciplinary action in 19 documented cases, termination in 4, and federal referral in 2. He had provided testimony before state legislative committees and 1 federal subcommittee on law enforcement accountability. His professional credentials were housed in systems that a standard law enforcement database query would not surface, not hidden exactly, but not visible to someone running a name through the routine search that Dover and Pruitt would have used. He had not told her earlier because if she had known, she would have led with it reasonably professionally, as any competent attorney would, and the moment she had led with it, Dover and Pruitt would have had time to adjust their story before the evidence existed to contradict it. They needed to commit fully to the falsified report, to the coordinated timestamps, to the pressure campaign, to all of it, before the footage came back and the emails were in hand and the audit trail was part of the IA file. They needed to be on the record with the lie before the truth was on the record beside it. I needed the evidence first, Elijah said. Then the identity. In that order. Cecile was very still. The quality of her stillness was the particular stillness of someone recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the sequence of events they'd been managing and finding that the recalibration was significant. So Grant Dover arrested the one professional in this city, she said carefully, whose entire career has been built on documenting exactly what Grant Dover did. He didn't know that, Elijah said. That's important. This has to be about what he did, not who I am. If it becomes about who I am, it becomes a story about one case. If it stays about what he did and what the camera caught and what the emails say, it becomes a story about a pattern. It will be both, Cecile said. Yes, Elijah said, but the both has to arrive in the right order. She pulled a fresh legal pad from the drawer and uncapped her pen. Walk me through every credential she said, every issuing body, every date, all of it. Right now. He talked, and she wrote, and outside the afternoon deepened, and the coffee she'd poured for him went cold on the table between them, and by the time he finished, she had filled 6 pages. Adam Reyes had been carrying the folded printout in his jacket for 11 days when he made the call, and in those 11 days he had slept badly and eaten without tasting things, and had gone through every shift at the precinct with the particular tension of a man who knows something that he has not yet decided what to do with. He had read Paula Gentry's article, the first one, the careful and hedged piece about 4 stops on Aberorn Street, the pattern without the witness, and he had found himself reading one paragraph 3 times. The paragraph that described a neighbor who had seen 2 of the stops from across the street, and who had decided after 6 years of walking the same road that this time it was worth saying something. The neighbor had not been named, but Adam knew what it meant to decide that something was worth saying, and he knew what it cost, and the knowledge of both things had been growing in weight since the evening he had first read the audit trail in the records room. He was not a hero. He knew that about himself, and he was at peace with it the same way you can be at peace with most things about yourself when you stop expecting yourself to be a different kind of person than you are. He was a 27-year-old in a job he needed, in a department where the wrong word to the wrong person had consequences that landed on you whether or not you deserved them. What he had was a printout, a phone number, and the understanding that the printout was not going to mean anything if it stayed in his jacket. He unfolded it on his kitchen table. He dialed the IA tip line anonymous, and when the prompt ended, he read from the document in a slow and level voice. The file numbers, the timestamps, the specific fields that had changed between version 1 and version 2. The before and after laid out as precisely as he could make it, because precision was the only thing he could control at this point, and he was going to control it completely. When he finished, he hung up, sat in the quiet of his kitchen for a while, and then went to bed. Dean Tolliver was in the IA office at 7:14 the following morning when the call transcription hit his inbox, and he had the audit trail from the off-site compliance server pulled up on his screen by 7:52, because the off-site server was exactly as described, and the audit trail was exactly as described, and Tolliver had been doing this work for 14 years, and he understood immediately what he was looking at and what it meant for what came next. He called Cecile Harmon at 8:30 a.m. "I'd like to meet with your client before the council session," he said in the deliberate and professionally contained voice of a man who has trained himself to keep his feelings in a drawer during working hours, as a courtesy. "I want him to know what we've opened." The coffee shop on Broughton Street was not a dramatic location, which was why Tolliver had chosen it. A place that looked like nowhere and sounded like nowhere, where 3 people sitting at a corner table with a folder between them looked like exactly what they might have been, which was 3 people having a morning meeting. Nothing more. Tolliver set the folder on the table and did not open it immediately. He looked at Elijah and said, "Mr. Cross, with the particular weight that comes from a man who has been in rooms where other people used other words, and who has chosen consciously and deliberately not to use those words himself." He had opened a formal preliminary inquiry case number assigned documentation in process based on the materials from Cecile's FOIA request. What the off-site audit trail confirmed was consistent with what the tip had described, which meant the tip was accurate, which meant someone inside the building had decided that the weight of what they knew was greater than the cost of putting it down. He opened the folder. 3 documents on the table face up side by side. The metadata comparison version 1 and version 2 of the incident report, timestamps annotated and highlighted the specific fields marked where the changes had been made. The email thread Prewitt to Hatch, the minutes matter for the grace period, with the reply from Hatch, and the follow-through in the dispatch log where a notation had been manually inserted after the fact using a slightly different typeface from the surrounding entries consistent with someone typing directly into the record rather than through the automatic dispatch recording system. And a list 5 vehicle stops. Aberorn Street Corridor, the month of July. All black male drivers, all stopped by Dover. All vehicles impounded 3 of the 5. Flagged by IA as potentially lacking documented probable cause. Elijah was the 5th. He looked at the list without moving. Looked at the 4 names above his, at the dates and the charge descriptions and the outcomes. 2 who had paid the misdemeanor fine and walked away because fighting required resources. They didn't have 1 still facing charges. 1 dismissed for lack of probable cause. And he absorbed it in the way he absorbed most things, which was completely and without visible reaction, because the reaction would come later in private, and this was not later. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has been informed that this documentation exists, Tolliver said. He paused. What they do with it depends on what comes out of tomorrow's session. He stood, shook Cecile's hand, then Elijah's. At the door, he stopped and turned back. And what he said next, he said directly to Elijah without looking at Cecile because it was meant for Elijah. The way you documented everything from the beginning, the notebook, the timestamps, the camera circuit, that's what made all of this traceable. Most people don't do that. Elijah nodded once. Tolliver walked out into the morning and Cecile watched him go and then looked at Elijah. He's telling you to bring everything tomorrow, she said. I know Elijah said. And the DOJ is watching. I know that too. He looked out the window at the street at the ordinary Tuesday morning traffic of a city that did not yet know what was going to happen in one of its second-floor committee rooms the following day, and he thought about the 4 names on Tolliver's list and about the notebooks those men had not kept, and the cameras they had not installed, and the signs they had not read past the first line. And he thought about all of it for a long, quiet moment before he turned back to Cecile and said, All right, let's go over everything one more time. By 8:50 in this morning, every chair in the City Hall committee room was filled, and people were standing along the walls in the particular patient way of people who have come somewhere important and who intend to stay, regardless of the discomfort of standing. Paula Gentry sat in the second row with a recording device resting on her knee and the expression of a woman who has been handed a story considerably larger than she expected and is managing the adjustment in real time. She had been tracking this for 6 weeks with public records and a neighbor's photographs, and what she was about to watch was the official record catching up to what she already knew, which was always the most important moment in any accountability story. The moment the institution has to say out loud what the documents have been saying quietly. Nora Bell was in the 4th row in the church dress she had pressed the night before, her hands folded in her lap, the dog left at home. She had walked Aberorn Street that morning on her way here, the same route she walked every morning, and she had paused at the corner of 52nd and looked at the parking sign on its post in the early light. And she had thought about the morning in July when she had stood at the edge of the sidewalk with the dog's leash short in her hand, watching, not looking away. Adam Reyes was not in the room. He was at his desk at the precinct processing intake forms with the specific focused attention of someone who is trying very hard not to think about what is happening 14 blocks away. His printout was in Tolliver's IA file. His anonymous call had done what it needed to do. What happened next was not in his hands, which was the only way he knew how to think about it. Councilwoman Diana Pruitt opened the session at 9 a.m. with the controlled energy of someone who has decided how this morning ends and is managing the performance of delivering it. Framing the session as a fact-finding inquiry, not a disciplinary hearing, emphasizing that no findings of misconduct would be made today, using the official language of institutional procedure to keep the shape of the room exactly as she wanted it. Dover sat in the 3rd row with his jaw tilted and his hands loose on his knees. The ease of a man who has walked into official proceedings before and who has walked out of them before without consequence, and who has, in the intervening time, forgotten to account for the possibility that this time might be different. Prewitt sat 2 seats from Dover with his arms folded and his face arranged into the stillness of a man who has reviewed his exposure and decided it is manageable, which was the same mistake that men in his position almost always made, and almost always made at exactly this stage of the process. Cecile stood at the podium. She was not a dramatic person. She had evidence. She began. She placed the first item on the table. A mounted photograph of the parking sign text enlarged the exception clause highlighted in yellow Elijah's documented arrival time, and the sign's applicable window spelled out in plain language that required no interpretation and offered no ambiguity. 118 minutes from the start of the restriction to the moment of arrest. Within the 2-hour grace period, by the sign's own terms. The second item was the metadata comparison. She walked the committee through both versions of the incident report, the blank narrative of version 1, the fully written narrative of version 2, the contact time that had migrated from blank to 10:30 a.m. in the 3 hours and 43 minutes between the 2 timestamps, and Councilmember Hayes leaned forward with the particular attention of a man who has been on this committee for 11 years and has learned to recognize when something is more significant than the language being used to describe it. "Ms. Harmon," he said, "you used the word tampered." "I did, sir. I'll substantiate that now." The third document was the email thread, and Cecile read it flat, without inflection, in the voice of someone who has learned that certain things don't need any help being what they are. They only need to be read aloud in a room full of people with the authority to respond to them. "Make sure the log reflects contact was initiated at 10:30, not 10:49. The minutes matter for the grace period." The youngest council member exhaled through her nose. It was not quite a sound, but it was audible in the specific silence that had settled over the room, the silence of a group of people who have just heard something and who are still in the moment of understanding what they have heard. Pruitt's jaw had tightened. She was very still. The fourth document was Hatch's reply, "Done." Also, subject didn't ask for counsel until after booking questions started, and Cecile noted clearly without raising her voice that her client had requested counsel before any interrogation began, and that the dash cam audio corroborated the timeline in precise and recoverable detail. The fifth was the pattern list: 4 additional stops by Dover in July alone, all on the Aberorn Street corridor, all black male drivers, all with vehicles impounded 3 flagged by Internal Affairs as potentially lacking documented probable cause. And when Hayes asked when IA had been consulted, Cecile gave the case number, and the room understood that the inquiry had been opened before this session and would continue after it. The sixth was the dash cam footage played on the room's projector, the timestamp visible in the upper right corner of every frame. 10:49 a.m., not 10:30. Dover's cruiser on the shoulder. The arrest. The grip on the arm, the angle of it capturing the force of it in a way that language had approximated, but that seeing it made undeniable. The shove. And then Elijah's voice on the audio, calm and exact and directed at the windshield with a clarity that filled the committee room 14 weeks after it had been spoken. "I am not resisting. I am complying. The time is 10:49 a.m. The room did not gasp. It absorbed. That is different and heavier and more lasting than a gasp. Dover's hands went flat on his thighs. He stopped looking at the screen and found a fixed point on the opposite wall and looked at that instead, and the particular stillness that settled over him was the stillness of a man who has understood fully and without any remaining room for adjustment that the version of events he arrived with this morning no longer exists. The seventh document was 1-page official letterhead photograph and identification number, and a professional biography in 3 short paragraphs. Cecile set it in the center of the table. "My client, Elijah Cross, is a senior investigator with the State Office of Law Enforcement Accountability. He has held this position for 11 years. In that time, he has reviewed officer conduct across 3 states, authored reports leading to disciplinary action in 19 documented cases, and provided testimony before state and federal legislative bodies on the subject of embedded misconduct in law enforcement." She set her pen down. "On July 14th, Officer Grant Dover arrested the one professional in this city whose entire career has been dedicated to documenting exactly what Officer Dover did. Hayes was the first to speak, and he spoke quietly in the register that serious men use when they understand the full dimension of what they are hearing. "Ms. Harmon, can you confirm that Dover and Pruitt had no knowledge of Mr. Cross's professional identity at the time of the arrest?" "No knowledge whatsoever," Cecile said. "They ran his name through standard databases. His credentials are housed in systems they did not have access to and did not query. So they proceeded entirely on what they saw," Cecile said. "A black man, a work truck, a public street." Wayne Pruitt stood. He did it without announcement, without drama, without the kind of visible distress that might have made the moment feel theatrical. He simply stood, moved to the end of his row with the quiet and deliberate efficiency of a man who has decided that the room no longer contains anything he is willing to be associated with, and walked to the side door, and the door closed behind him with a soft click, that in the specific silence of that room at that moment was one of the loudest sounds anyone had heard all morning. Pruitt looked up at the sound. Something shifted in her face, not guilt exactly, but the specific recalculation of a person who has just understood that the architecture of the situation is fundamentally different from what she was told it would be, and who is working through the implications of that difference in real time in front of a room full of people. Dover didn't move. He was still looking at the fixed point on the wall, and Nora Bell from the fourth row was watching him, and she recognized the expression on his face in the way that people recognize things they have seen before, have been adjacent to before in forms that differed in detail, but not in essence the expression of a man who has just been named in front of everyone and cannot find a way to make that naming mean something other than what it means. Hayes looked at Pruitt. "Councilwoman, the documentation in front of us includes what appears to be direct evidence of a falsified official report and coordinated alteration of evidence. I don't think advisement is the appropriate response." Pruitt held his gaze for a long moment. The room waited. "You're correct," she said. "This is under formal review, effective now." She had arrived this morning prepared to say isolated incident. She was leaving this room saying under review. The distance between those two phrases contained everything. The emails, the timestamps, the footage, the 5 names on the list, the 11 days of a folded printout in a young clerk's jacket, the morning a 60-something woman on a dog walk decided to take out her phone and document what she was seeing. Paula Gentry was writing without looking at her notepad the way experienced journalists write when they can't afford to look away from what's happening. And then as the session was adjourning and people were beginning to stand and gather their things, Dover finally moved. He rose from his seat and turned toward the door, and for 1 second on his way out he passed the row where Elijah Cross was seated, and their eyes met. Dover's gaze broke away, first dropping to the floor, then finding a direction that wasn't Elijah's face, and he continued to the door and through it without stopping. Elijah watched him go, and his expression held nothing except the steady and uninterrupted attention of a man who has seen the thing he came to see, and who understands that the seeing of it was the whole point, and who does not need anything from the moment beyond that. No triumph, no performance. Just the particular clarity of someone who has been right about something that matters and has not needed to be loud about it. Tolliver found them in the hallway outside the committee room in the morning light coming through the tall windows of the second floor, and he shook Cecile's hand and then Elijah's with the formality of a man for whom handshakes are still a deliberate and meaningful act. Formal, aye. "A hearing for Dover and Pruitt will be scheduled within 30 days, he said. "The recommendation for immediate suspension without pay goes to the deputy chief this afternoon." "Will he act on it?" Cecile asked. "He'll push back. He'll want administrative leave with pay less visible, easier to manage with the union. But I've got 14 years of formal recommendations in the file, and the deputy chief is going to have to explain publicly if he doesn't follow this one." He paused, and then he looked at Elijah, and what he said next had the quality of something that had been decided on before he got here. Something he'd thought about in the car on the way over, or the night before, when the hearing preparation was done, and there was just the quiet of a man thinking about what he was going to say. "I want you to know something, Mr. Cross. I've been doing this work for 14 years. I've watched people try to fight back against this kind of thing with nothing but their own word. It almost never works because the institution has more words than any one person does, and more time to arrange them. What you built, the notebook, the camera circuit, the timestamps, every follow-through. That's what made this provable. Not your title, not your position. What you documented. On a Saturday morning, before anything had gone wrong." He paused again. "I just wanted you to know that." Tolliver walked down the hall with the unhurried stride of a man who has more work to do today and intends to do it. Cecile watched him go. Then she looked at Elijah. "You're thinking about the 4 other names." "Yes," Elijah said. "So am I." He stood for a moment at the window looking out at the street below where the ordinary Tuesday afternoon of Savannah was proceeding without any awareness of what had just happened in the room behind him, and he thought about those 4 men and about the notebooks they hadn't kept, and about the signs they had driven past without reading to the 3rd line, and about what it would mean to do something with that, not just for this case, not just for the record, but for the next Saturday morning on the next Aberorn Street. The days after the hearing moved the way accountability almost always moves inside institutions in partial increments with long silences in between each small development, requiring twice as much time as it should and producing half the result that the evidence warranted. And none of that was surprising to anyone who had been paying attention. Dover and Prewitt were placed on administrative leave with pay, not suspension without pay. The union had moved fast, and the deputy chief had moved in the direction the union pointed, and Tolliver had filed his formal objection to the record the same afternoon, because if it couldn't be stopped, it could at least be documented, and documentation was how things that mattered stayed in the record long enough to matter again later. Prewitt's office issued a statement that used the phrase "the department is committed to reviewing documentation protocols." No names, no timeline, no acknowledgement of the specific acts that the hearing had placed in the public record, and the Savannah Paper's reporter called for comment on the falsified report specifically, and received 4 sentences that said nothing in the most official language available. Paula Gentry published her piece the following week. 600 words precisely organized, sourced entirely from documents in the public record, the hearing transcript, the FOIA emails, the IA case number. Elijah's name and title printed in full with his explicit permission, and it was not sensational because sensational pieces get argued with and precise pieces get read by the people who can do something with them. And Paula Gentry had been doing this long enough to know the difference. It was read by people in offices in Atlanta and in Washington, D.C., and by people in Savannah who had driven past a parking sign on Aberorn Street 100 times without reading past the first line, and it meant different things to each of them, and all of those meanings were the right ones. Hatch retained a criminal defense attorney within 48 hours of the hearing and stopped speaking to anyone in the department without counsel present. The referral for her after-hours system access was forwarded to the DA's office, where it would sit in a queue and wait its turn, because that is what referrals do, and waiting was not the same as disappearing. Paula Gentry's article named Nora Bell with Nora's permission as the neighbor who had photographed the scene on the morning of July 14th, and who had come forward with what she knew. Nora was not prepared for what followed. Neighbors knocked on her door on the day the piece ran. People from her church called. A woman she had never met left a folded note in her mailbox, and Nora read it standing in the hall with her coat still on, the dog circling her feet. "Thank you for not looking away." She sat down at the kitchen table with the note in her hand and the dog settled at her feet, and she thought about the morning she had looped back on her walk because the dog wanted to go the long way, and about standing at the edge of the sidewalk with the leash held short, and about almost not stopping, almost turning back toward home because whatever was happening at that corner was not her business, and she was just a woman walking her dog. She had stopped. She had stayed. She had taken out her phone and photographed a truck, some tools on a rag, and a parking sign, and she had done it because something had told her it was important, and she had trusted that telling which was a smaller thing than it sounded like and a bigger thing than most people credited themselves for. She called Paula the afternoon the piece ran. "I need you to know something," she said. "I've walked that street every morning for 6 years. I've seen those stops before. I never took a picture before. I don't know exactly why I did it that morning. Because something felt different," Paula said. Nora was quiet for a moment. He didn't look afraid. That's what it was. He looked like a man doing a job. And I thought someone should remember what that looked like. Paula wrote it down. And what Nora didn't know, and what she would only understand later, was that this was the thing she had actually done. Not just taken a photograph, but remembered out loud in a form that lasted. And that remembering it turned out was the whole point. Adam Reyes found out about the hearing outcomes the way most people in the precinct found out through the institutional grapevine that operates in break rooms and hallways, and in the particular quality of silence that settles over a department when something significant has happened, and everyone is waiting to see who says it out loud first. Someone in the break room said it was political. Someone else said nothing. Adam sat at his desk and looked at his screen. He thought about the night he printed the audit trail, the weight of the folded paper in his jacket pocket. The 11 days of carrying it before he made the call, the specific exhaustion of knowing something and not yet having decided what to do with it. He thought about the tip line, the slow, careful voice he had used reading from the document in the quiet of his kitchen, the way he had hung up and sat in the silence afterward, and not felt like a hero. Which was fine because heroism had nothing to do with it. He had done the smallest possible thing, made a call read from a document hung up. That was all. The audit trail had done the rest because the audit trail had existed because the department had updated its compliance system 6 weeks before any of this happened, because sometimes the thing that saves the truth is something nobody was thinking about when they put it in place. His phone buzzed. Paula Gentry's article. He read it once, found the place in it where his contribution lived, unnamed, unquoted present in the shape of what had been proven, and he set the phone face down on his desk. He went back to work. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough. The civil suit was filed 47 days after the arrest, and the city's attorney's office made a settlement offer before the discovery process had run its full course. Standard municipal terms, no admission of wrongdoing. Confidentiality clause applying only to the financial amount, the public record remaining exactly what it was. Elijah read the terms at Cecile's office on a Tuesday afternoon, with the settlement letter on the table between them and the sound of the street coming through the window. "If I accept this," he said, "does it close the DOJ inquiry?" "No," Cecile said. "The inquiry is independent. The public record from the hearing exists regardless of what you sign. The IA outcomes are already on record. The emails are in the public record. None of that changes." He thought about the 4 other men on Tolliver's list, about the 2 who had paid the fine because fighting cost too much, about the week-to-week room near the water, the 3 months of unpaid leave, the accordion folder on the passenger seat of the truck, about what it meant to put a number on what had happened to him on a Saturday morning when he was fixing a fuel pump, and a man decided that the sign meant whatever he decided it meant. He signed. That same week he called Cecile with a different request. Not legal, but connected to everything that had led them here. He wanted to put something in the public record, not about his case specifically, but about the method, the documentation practice, the notebook and the camera, and the habit of reading the sign and writing down the time. He wanted it in a form that other people could use because the 4 names on Tolliver's list were not unique, and Aberorn Street was not unique. And the problem was not going to be solved by one accountability investigator knowing how to document what happened to him. Cecile put him in touch with a community organization on the east side of the city. He made a call. A date was set. The building was not impressive, a converted commercial space with folding chairs and a projector screen that tilted slightly to the left, and the combined smell of old carpet and coffee that belongs to rooms where practical things happen, where people come not for an experience, but for information they intend to use. 34 people were waiting when Elijah walked in, mostly in their 40s and 50s and 60s, with a handful younger people who had come because of Nora's story. Paula's article, a bulletin posted at a church on MLK Boulevard, a text forwarded through a neighborhood group by someone whose cousin had been stopped on Aberorn 18 months ago and who had paid the fine because he didn't know what else to do. They had come because someone they trusted had told them there was a man who knew what to do, and that turned out to be a powerful reason to get in a folding chair on a Thursday evening. Nora Bell was in the front row, hands folded, the same posture she'd had in the committee room, the posture of a woman who has decided to be present for something and intends to remain present for all of it. When Elijah walked in, she looked at him and nodded the same nod as the morning on Aberorn. The acknowledgement between two people who have each seen the other doing the right thing without any guarantee that it would matter. He nodded back. In the last row in civilian clothes, no badge visible, sat Adam Reyes. He had come because the flyer had said Community Documentation Workshop, and because he had spent enough time thinking about the gap between what institutions record and what actually happens that the subject had become personal to him in ways he was still working out. He did not make eye contact with Elijah when he came in. But Elijah saw him, and the small acknowledgement he offered, barely a nod, barely anything, was enough because both of them understood that some things don't require more than that. Elijah stood at the front of the room. He did not have a prepared speech. He had the spiral notebook and a pen, the same blue Bic in a pack of 12, and he set them on the table in front of him and looked out at the 34 people who had come to a converted commercial space on a Thursday evening because they wanted to know what to do. The first thing you do, he said, is read the sign. He paused for a moment and let the simplicity of it land because simple things sometimes need a moment of silence to reveal their full weight. Whatever sign is in front of you. The parking notice. The ordinance posted at the door. The terms at the bottom of the form. You read it. All of it. Not just the first line. Because the first line is written for the people they expect to stop. The rest of it. The exception clause. The fine print. The part that's faded from the weather, that part is written for the people who know to keep reading. He picked up the notebook and held it where they could see it. The second thing you do is write down the time. Not because you're expecting trouble, because documentation is how truth survives contact with power. And you don't know when you pull onto a street on a Saturday morning to fix your truck which morning is going to be the one that matters. A woman in the third row 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head was crying quietly, in the way people cry when something touches something real, not from grief, but from the particular ache of recognition of having been in a situation and not known what to do, and wishing afterward that someone had told them something as simple as, write down the time. A man in his 60s near the back raised his hand. What if you don't have a camera? Then you have the notebook, Elijah said. And if you don't have the notebook, you have your phone and you start a voice memo. And if you don't have your phone, you write it down the minute you get somewhere you can write. The time, the badge number, every word spoken in the order it was spoken. Because they will write their version of events afterward, and the question is whether yours exists beside it. Nora Bell from the front row said quietly, I just took some pictures. I didn't know if it would matter. Elijah looked at her for a moment. It's in the official record of a city council proceeding, he said. It helped open a federal inquiry. It mattered. She pressed her lips together and nodded, and the woman next to her reached over and put a hand on her arm without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. Elijah opened the notebook to a clean page. He wrote the date at the top and the time, and then he looked up at the 34 people in the folding chairs. Let's start from the beginning, he said. 34 pens uncapped. The room leaned forward. On Aberorn Street, the parking sign stands on its standard municipal post in the morning light of an October Thursday, the paint slightly more weathered than it was in July. The lettering faded to a shade that requires you to stop and look directly at it, rather than reading it in passing. The first line, no parking, 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., weekdays, is still the boldest. The exception clause at the third line is still there in smaller letters, the ink worn by months of sun and rain, to a gray that most people drive past without registering, because most people have learned to read only as far as the restriction, and to stop there, because the restriction is where they've been told the story ends. Elijah Cross read past the restriction. And because he did 34 people in a room on the east side of Savannah, now know the exception clause exists and will read for it and will write down the time. Grant Dover's formal suspension hearing is scheduled for November. Wayne Pruitt's name is part of a federal pattern of practice inquiry that will take years to resolve. Somewhere in Atlanta, a sealed email with a council office return address waits for a court to decide whether the name behind two initials belongs to the public record. The institution is slow. It always has been. But it is moving now, and it is moving because one man on a Saturday morning in July set down his wrench, deliberately slid out from under a truck without rushing, and spoke clearly toward a windshield that was still recording in the full knowledge that the truth once documented is harder to erase than the people erasing it usually expect. In the notebook on page 31, the entry from July 14th is still exactly where it was written. 6:51 a.m. Arrived Aberorn at 52nd. Sign read. Exception clause applies. Triangles deploying. 47 words that started all of it. Elijah did not write them because he was expecting a confrontation. He wrote them because that is what he does every morning on every street, whether anyone is watching or not, because documentation is how truth survives, contact with power, and because you never know when you pull out the notebook which morning is going to be the one that matters. He has always known that. He knows it still. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of someone you know or something you've seen or a moment when you wished you'd known what to do, don't scroll away. Leave us a comment below and tell us what justice means to you. And if you believe that stories like this one deserve to be heard, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, because every person who watches is another person who knows to read past the first line.